Welcome back. In this video, I'll walk you through how I fix this board. What happened to it is unclear. If I had to guess, I would say some heat and maybe something heavy was involved. I start by assessing the damage. There is really two sections, the deep one that will need to be cut out and foam replaced, and the shallow on the sides that can just be filled out. Just to be sure, I check the deck, everything is flat on that side. That flexible ruler is perfect to follow the rocker, so I can slide it along the deeper damage to see where it starts and where it stops. For the deep damage, my plan is to cut off the skin, root out all the compressed foam, replace it, and then cover it with a new skin. And for the shallow area, I will fill it with microballoon and then cover it with the same skin as the rest. Of course, always wear a mask when you cut carbon. Now that the cut is clean, with a little bit of persuasion, the skin comes off with no problem. The bottom of the skin, take some polystyrene with it. That's very good news for the rest of the board. It means delamination is likely not a problem. The less good news is that repair. It didn't bond really well. And judging by the smell, I suspect that was polyester. And polyester don't bond well to epoxy. Next, I need a flat reference for the rotor to ride along to be able to cut the damaged foam. To do that kind of repair, I have a modification I make to the router. I remove the front plate and replace it with a long, flat board that I can route through. And then I can adjust the depth to route the necessary amount of foam. But yeah, I miscalculated that one. That looks much better. I don't need to be perfectly flat, just flat enough to glue the replacement foam. Let's go. Now that the damage is clean, I need to make a template to cut the replacement foam. The blue painter's tape is perfect for that. It stays flat, won't shrink or move after when I use it to cut my piece. And on top of making the template, the area is already ready and masked up for gluing. The EPS I'm using is a rough cut from my perm foil board, and the density is very close to what the board is using. First, I do a rough cut with a Stanley knife, and then go back and slightly sand it into shape. Test, sand again, test, sand again, until I get a good fit. At this stage, the eye don't matter. I'll correct that later when I add the skin. Before putting any glue anywhere, I'm making sure I have all the setup ready to clamp it later. You don't want to be looking around for pieces of wood and clamps once the glue is already setting. To bond EPS to EPS, I almost always use Gorilla Glue. It foams up when it cures and stays very flexible, unlike epoxy, so it makes it easier to sand at the boundary between blocks. The cure is activated by water. Even if it can cure with water from the air, it's better to wet the other side of the piece you're trying to glue together. That glue foams up when it cures, so it will push your pieces apart. That's why you really need to have them tight. Not extra tight, but tight enough to keep them from moving out. After a couple hours, the glue is cured. That's why I left the blue tape after doing my template. It makes cleanup of the squeeze out much easier. And now I can shape the extra EPS. Here I'm aiming to have the level of the EPS slightly below the skin, to give me space for some fairing and the new skin that I will add after. For the fairing to adhere well, I have to roughen up all the existing skin, to remove the top surface and get back to bare carbon. So I prepare both the shallow defect and the deeper one. After removing most of the sanding dust, I can mask the area to reduce the cleanup that I'll have to do later. And that small lip will later avoid resin to drip on the floor. It's not a big deal, but the less cleaning the better. The fairing mix is mostly epoxy and microballoon. I add a little bit of silica just to keep it from flowing too much, and the black pigment will help to hide the repair if the weave of the carbon I add on top get a little bit distorted. When I apply the fairing, I make sure to press hard on the first pass to make sure there's no air bubble trapped under. And then I just spread it as equally as I can to make sure I'm a little bit above the level I'm shooting for. There's nothing worse than a low spot when you finish sanding and you have to go back and fair again. The next day, the epoxy is fully cured and ready to be sanded back. I start sanding all the high spots aggressively with an 80 grit disc. And then I slow down with higher grit and using the tape to know when I reach the right level. It's really important to keep moving the disc constantly to avoid putting too much heat into resin. That would soften it and make it harder to sand. When I'm starting to see the edge of the tape all around, I remove all the masking to do the fine tuning with the sanding disc. For that step, I turn much slower and look for when the straight boundary disappears. Once the fairing is leveled, I finish the preparation by exposing the carbon all around the repair. That's where the new skin will be bonded. To make sure the epoxy adheres well, I use denatured alcohol to clean up the area. Soapy water would also work, but I prefer alcohol as it dries much faster. And it's time to mask. Again, just outside the exposed carbon this time. For the carbon, I'm using leftover from a previous project. This is plain with 180 grams by square meter, and it's matching exactly what was used on the board. I'm cutting the carbon to fit right inside the tape, not overlap it. It will make it easier later to further repair to the board. The tape is really just here to avoid resin streaks and to see when the peel ply is well saturated. And again, before mixing my epoxy, I made sure to have the right piece of peel ply ready, all half cuts, and a clean squeegee to apply the epoxy. As I'm adding peel ply after, I'm not too concerned with having a right amount of epoxy. It's better to have a little bit too much and then squeeze it out after. When I put the peel ply, it absorbs most of the excess, and then as you can see here, you can slowly push the excess to the blue tape. Next day, when everything is cured, peel time. As I cut the carbon to stay inside the masking, the blue tape is pretty easy to remove. Below the peel ply, the lamination is pretty smooth, but I still need to sand the whole surface to 1. Fare it into the board, and 2. Remove any high spots. Of course, that sanding is going through carbon, so I'm wearing a mask through the whole process. You can see that my hands and arms are still exposed, so yeah, I will be itching a little bit. But you can mitigate it to some extent. Before starting any work, you can put some talcum powder over all your exposed skin. That will fill in your pores and avoid the fiber to get there and itch you afterward. Back to the repair. After a quick clean with alcohol, the repair looked good. Now I need to somehow mimic the finish. Just from a process point of view, that repair still needs a slight fairing and a clear coat on top to protect it and blend into the rest of the board. But to make the finish, I want to try to do it with microballoon. For that fairing, for easy sanding, I'm just using microballoon and a little bit of white tint. Yeah, okay, you saw that. Again, for your pleasure. Good try. At least I was wearing my mask. Just to be clear, I have no idea what I'm doing here. So I'm just trying a little bit first, and it's obviously not opaque enough. With more microballoon, it looks slightly better. A bit more tint, and the white seems to be matching what's on the board. Here I'm just applying a very thin coat, trying to be a little bit streaky, but most of it will be sanded off anyway. Again, I'm keeping the blue tape when I do most of the sanding to protect the board around the repair. And when I'm close enough, I can remove it and finish fairing perfectly flat. Here also, despite the dust, your hand is the best way to know when you get something fair with no steps. A quick hand sand to remove the last few ridges, and I can now clean the wall area with alcohol again. Okay, that fairing didn't completely match the finish, but it's hiding the repair a little bit. So it's time for plan B. Paint the streaky finish, and then clear coat on top. The paint I'm using here is acrylic paint, slightly watered down to get it a little bit transparent and match the actual finish. And looks not that bad. The carbon still appears a bit grey, but there is still one coat of resin to go on top that will make it appear darker. The masking for that final clear coat is a few centimeters outside the repair, to make sure everything is covered. That clear coat is pure epoxy. I apply it very thinly, and I use a paintbrush going lengthwise, widthwise, and 45 degrees to make it as flat as possible. Once cured, I can remove the tape for the last time. The final sand is just meant to remove the step where the tape was and remove the shine from the epoxy for the last clear coat. As the rails are very thin, it's much easier to fine-tune them by hand instead of taking the risk to go through with a sander. That board has a matte finish, so after doing a final cleanup and remove every speck of dust, I can finally do a clear coat with an acrylic spray. There are plenty of clear coat options, some with two parts that may be stronger, but I like that Rust-Oleum. It's easy to apply, doesn't drip too much, dries quicker, and does a decent job to protect against UV. After a few coats, when the area is properly covered, I like to do a slight wet sand to blend it with the rest of the board. 400 grit first, then properly clean up, remove the dust, and a quick pass with 800. And finally, wasteland layer overlapping the board and the repair. And as you can see, it's not invisible, but it blends in pretty well. One more board ready to go in the water. To be fair, this one was not in danger. No water was getting in, but it had a bad repair and a few damage, so it was worth doing. Before giving it back, I reinstalled the plug. I remove it to avoid issue with the air trapped inside when temperature is moving and you do a new lamination. In his bag, good to go. Thanks for watching, and go take care of your board.